Imagine standing in the middle of a city that never sleeps. A city made of steel, noise, ambition, loneliness, hope, fear, and dreams stacked on top of one another like unfinished thoughts. Now imagine writing a letter to that city. Not a love letter, not a complaint, but a confession. A confession about who you were before the world shaped you. Before pain taught you lessons you never asked for. Before you learned to survive instead of live. Let me ask you something very personal. Have you ever felt like you were becoming someone, but didn't recognize who that someone was anymore? Have you ever felt fractured, like pieces of your identity were scattered across different versions of you? The child you were, the adult you became, and the person you're still trying to be? If yes, then stay with me until the end of this video. Because this book is not just about New York. It's not even just about the author. It's about you. Dear New York is a mirror disguised as a memoir. It's a conversation between a woman and a city, but beneath that, it's a conversation between a soul and itself. And by the time you finish listening to this summary, you may realize something unsettling. The city you've been writing letters to your whole life may not be New York at all. It might be your past, your trauma, your younger self, or the life you thought you'd have by now. This book can change you, not because it gives instructions, but because it gives permission. Permission to feel, permission to remember, permission to become whole again. So take a breath, slow down, and let's begin this journey together. Before we dive into the soul of the book, it's important to understand who is speaking to us. Stephanie Blanch is not writing as a motivational guru or a polished self-help expert. She writes as a woman who has lived inside her own contradictions. Her credibility does not come from titles or theories. It comes from experience. She writes from fractured beginnings. The early emotional breaks that shaped how she loves, how she fears, how she dreams. She explores how childhood wounds don't disappear when we grow older. They just change costumes. As children, we think pain will end when we grow up. As adults, we realize pain simply evolves. It becomes quieter, more intellectual, more disguised. The book gently shows how unhealed beginnings follow us into adult relationships, careers, and choices, like invisible scripts playing in the background. Stephanie reflects on how she once believed moving to a new place would create a new self. But geography doesn't heal what memory keeps alive. And this is one of the book's most important truths. You can leave a place, but you cannot leave yourself. So many people believe change comes from external movement, new cities, new jobs, new relationships. But the book asks a deeper question. What happens when you arrive somewhere new? And the same emotional patterns unpack themselves with you? As the narrative deepens, Stephanie begins to explore identity fragmentation. She describes the feeling of being many people at once. The ambitious woman chasing dreams, the wounded child seeking safety, the adult pretending to be okay. This fragmentation is something most people never name, but deeply feel. We are rarely one person. We are collections of survival strategies. The book explains this not as a weakness, but as a response. When life overwhelms us early, we learn to divide ourselves to cope. One part stays strong. One part stays quiet. One part dreams. One part remembers. The problem is not fragmentation. The problem is never reuniting those parts. Stephanie shows how adulthood often rewards productivity, confidence, and resilience, but punishes vulnerability and reflection. So we perform wellness while privately breaking. And New York, with its relentless pace, magnifies this reality. The city rewards those who keep moving. It doesn't stop for your pain. It doesn't ask how you're doing. In that environment, self-reflection becomes both necessary and terrifying. The book captures this tension beautifully, the desire to succeed versus the need to heal. One of the most powerful undercurrents of the book is emotional honesty. Stephanie doesn't romanticize suffering. She doesn't glorify trauma. Instead, she tells the truth, that healing is messy, nonlinear, and often lonely. She explores moments of self-doubt, comparison, exhaustion, and longing. Moments where ambition feels hollow. Moments where independence feels isolating. Moments where strength feels performative. And this is where the book becomes deeply relatable. Because in modern life, many people are silently exhausted. We chase growth, but don't rest. We curate success, but neglect wholeness. We chase identity without understanding our roots. The book asks, what if becoming yourself requires slowing down instead of speeding up? What if healing is not a destination, but a relationship with your own past? What if strength includes softness? Psychologically, this book works because it validates experiences many people feel but don't articulate. Validation reduces shame, and shame is one of the biggest blockers to growth. When people feel broken without language, they assume they are alone. This book gives language. It explains why people repeat patterns, stay in familiar pain, or fear stillness. Without awareness, we let our past run our present. With awareness, we begin to choose differently. Stephanie doesn't offer formulas, she offers reflection. And reflection is powerful because it returns agency to the reader. As we move further into the book, Stephanie begins reframing becoming. Becoming is not about fixing yourself. It's about understanding yourself. Not about erasing the past, but integrating it. She challenges the idea that you must be fully healed before living. Instead, she suggests that living itself is part of healing. This is especially important in a culture obsessed with optimization. People delay joy until they feel worthy. Delay rest until they feel successful. Delay self-acceptance until they feel complete. But the book gently insists, you are allowed to be unfinished. You are allowed to be learning. You are allowed to be in progress. And here, the city becomes symbolic again. New York is always under construction, always changing, always incomplete. And yet, it functions. It lives. It breathes. It moves. The city does not wait to be perfect before existing. Neither should you. As the story continues, the tone of Dear New York begins to shift, quietly, subtly, from observation to confrontation. Stephanie is no longer just describing the city or her feelings inside it. She begins to question herself. And this is where the book becomes uncomfortable in the most necessary way. She starts noticing patterns. Patterns in the people she's drawn to. Patterns in the choices she keeps making. Patterns in how she reacts to stress, loneliness, success, and disappointment. And slowly, she realizes something most people avoid admitting. Her present life is not random. It is consistent with her unresolved past. This realization is powerful because it breaks the illusion that life is simply happening to us. The book gently introduces the idea of emotional inheritance, the invisible beliefs, fears, and coping mechanisms we carry from childhood into adulthood without questioning them. Stephanie reflects on how early experiences taught her what love feels like, what safety looks like, and what she must do to be accepted, not through lectures, not through rules, but through moments, silences, absences, inconsistencies, expectations. And like most people, she didn't consciously choose these lessons, she absorbed them. The book explains something deeply psychological but very human. Children don't learn from what they're told. They learn from what they experience. If safety felt temporary, you grow up bracing for loss. Stephanie begins to see how these early emotional blueprints followed her into adult relationships, not because she wanted them to, but because they felt familiar. And familiarity is powerful. The book explains why people often confuse familiarity with destiny. We don't choose what's healthy, we choose what feels known. As this realization unfolds, Stephanie's inner dialogue becomes louder. She starts writing about the voice inside her head, the one that critiques, doubts, compares, and pressures. This inner voice didn't appear randomly. It was built from expectations, from survival, from moments where being quiet felt safer than being honest. The book explores how many people develop an internal supervisor, a voice that monitors behavior to prevent rejection or failure. It says things like, don't say that, don't need too much, don't rest yet, don't fall behind. At first, this voice helps us survive. Later, it controls us. Stephanie shows how living in a city like New York amplifies this voice. There's always someone doing more, achieving faster, living louder. Comparison becomes constant. And when comparison becomes your reference point, self-worth becomes unstable. The book doesn't blame ambition. It questions what ambition is trying to protect. Is it passion? Or is it fear of being insignificant? Is it growth? Or is it avoidance of stillness? These questions are never answered directly. They're felt. One of the most emotionally resonant parts of the book is how Stephanie describes loneliness in crowded places. She writes about being surrounded by people and still feeling unseen. And this is where many listeners will quietly nod to themselves. Because modern loneliness isn't about isolation. It's about disconnection from authenticity. You can be surrounded by conversations and still feel unheard. Surrounded by movement and still feel stuck. And familiarity is powerful. The book explains why people often confuse familiarity with destiny. We don't choose what's healthy, we choose what feels known. As this realization unfolds, Stephanie's inner dialogue becomes louder. She starts writing about the voice inside her head, the one that critiques, doubts, compares, and pressures. This inner voice didn't appear randomly. It was built from expectations, from survival, from moments where being quiet felt safer than being honest. The book explores how many people develop an internal supervisor, a voice that monitors behavior to prevent rejection or failure. It says things like, "Don't say that. Don't need too much. Don't rest yet. Don't fall behind." At first, this voice helps us survive. Later, it controls us. Stephanie shows how living in a city like New York amplifies this voice. There's always someone doing more, achieving faster, living louder. Comparison becomes constant. And when comparison becomes your reference point, self-worth becomes unstable. The book doesn't blame ambition. It questions what ambition is trying to protect. Is it passion? Or is it fear of being insignificant? Is it growth? Or is it avoidance of stillness? These questions are never answered directly. They're felt. One of the most emotionally resonant parts of the book is how Stephanie describes loneliness in crowded places. She writes about being surrounded by people and still feeling unseen. And this is where many listeners will quietly nod to themselves. Because modern loneliness isn't about isolation. It's about disconnection from authenticity. You can be surrounded by conversations and still feel unheard. Surrounded by movement and still feel stuck. Stephanie reflects on how she learned to present a version of herself that was digestible, capable, and composed, while keeping the more tender parts hidden. Not because she was dishonest, but because she was protecting herself. The book explains that many adults are not emotionally unavailable. They are emotionally guarded. There's a difference. Unavailable means unwilling. Guarded means wounded. This insight alone can change how people view themselves and others. As the narrative continues, Stephanie begins exploring the concept of self-worth, not as confidence, but as permission. Permission to rest. Permission to say no. Permission to exist without proving value. She realizes that much of her drive came from trying to feel enough. Enough to be chosen. Enough to be respected. Enough to be safe. And this is where the book connects deeply to modern life, money, and success. Because many people don't chase success for joy, they chase it for relief. Relief from anxiety. Relief from shame. Relief from the fear of being disposable. The book doesn't criticize success. It questions the emotional cost of chasing it without self-awareness. What happens when your worth is tied to productivity? What happens when rest feels like failure? What happens when slowing down feels dangerous? Stephanie describes moments where exhaustion felt like achievement, where burnout felt like proof of commitment. And eventually, she confronts the truth. If your value depends on output, you will never feel secure. Because output can always stop. Psychologically, the book begins transitioning from recognition to responsibility. Not blame, responsibility. Stephanie acknowledges that while her past shaped her, her present choices sustain the patterns. This is a difficult realization, but an empowering one. Because if patterns are learned, they can be unlearned. The book emphasizes that healing doesn't mean blaming parents, circumstances, or cities. It means understanding how experiences shaped your nervous system. Why you react before you think. Why silence feels heavy. Why closeness feels risky. Why stillness feels uncomfortable. Once you understand your reactions, you can respond differently. Awareness creates space. Space creates choice. One of the most powerful metaphors in the book is the idea of becoming whole. Not by removing broken parts, but by welcoming them back. Stephanie describes moments where she allowed herself to sit with discomfort instead of escaping it. Moments where she listened instead of distracting herself. Moments where she let herself feel sadness without immediately justifying it. And she realizes something profound. Healing doesn't come from fixing emotions. It comes from feeling them fully. Most people numb pain because they fear being overwhelmed. But emotions don't disappear when ignored, they wait. The book gently teaches that emotions move when they're acknowledged. Resistance keeps them stuck. Presence lets them pass. As the city continues to play its role, Stephanie's relationship with New York begins to change. It stops being an enemy, stops being a fantasy. It becomes a backdrop rather than a definition. She realizes she doesn't need the city to validate her becoming. She doesn't need to earn her existence through struggle. This is a subtle but radical shift. Because many people build identity around hardship. They fear healing will make them ordinary. They fear softness will make them weak. The book challenges that belief. Wholeness doesn't erase depth. It integrates it. As we move deeper into Dear New York, the story shifts again. This time toward one of the most sensitive and revealing areas of the human experience, relationships. Not romanticized relationships. Not cinematic love stories. But real, imperfect, emotionally complex connections. Stephanie begins examining how fractured beginnings don't disappear when love enters the picture. They surface. She writes about attraction not as coincidence, but as recognition. We are drawn to what matches our emotional blueprint. Not what is best for us, but what feels familiar to our nervous system. And this is where the book becomes painfully honest. She notices how independence became her armor, how strength became her identity, how needing less felt safer than needing honestly. The book explains something many people struggle to articulate. Some people don't fear intimacy because they don't want connection. They fear intimacy because closeness threatens the strategies that once kept them safe. If you learned early that relying on others led to disappointment, you learned self-sufficiency. If vulnerability felt dangerous, you learned control. If emotional expression wasn't welcomed, you learned silence. Stephanie reflects on moments where she appeared strong but felt unseen. Moments where she was present but emotionally distant. Not because she lacked love, but because she feared losing herself in it. The book gently dismantles the myth that independence is always strength. Sometimes independence is self-protection disguised as empowerment. As relationships come and go, Stephanie begins noticing how attachment patterns repeat. She explores the push and pull dynamic. Wanting closeness, then retreating when it arrives. Wanting to be known, then hiding when seen. This inner conflict is something many people experience, but rarely name. The book explains it simply. We crave connection, but connection activates our deepest fears. Fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of being too much, fear of being not enough. So we oscillate. We move toward love, then away. We open, then close. We hope, then brace for disappointment. Stephanie doesn't judge herself for this. She studies it. And that shift from judgment to curiosity is transformative. Because when you stop shaming yourself for patterns, you can begin changing them. One of the most profound ideas in the book is the concept of emotional safety. Not comfort, not chemistry, safety. Stephanie begins asking herself, do I feel safe being honest? Do I feel safe being inconsistent? Do I feel safe not being impressive? Many relationships fail not because of lack of love, but lack of safety. When people feel unsafe, they perform. When they feel safe, they reveal. The book shows how safety is not about guarantees. It's about permission. Permission to feel. Permission to express. Permission to exist without strategy. And this realization doesn't just apply to relationships with others. It applies to the relationship with yourself. As the narrative deepens, Stephanie turns inward again. She confronts the parts of herself she abandoned to survive. The sensitive part, the hopeful part, the part that believed without proof. She realizes that adulthood often rewards suppression. We're taught to be realistic, be strong, be professional. But realism without compassion becomes cynicism. Strength without softness becomes rigidity. Professionalism without authenticity becomes emptiness. The book asks a powerful question. What parts of yourself did you exile to fit into the world? And what did it cost you? Psychologically, this section of the book explains how self-abandonment becomes normalized. People learn to ignore intuition, dismiss emotions, override needs. They call it maturity. But unresolved needs don't disappear. They express themselves through anxiety, burnout, resentment, and disconnection. Stephanie describes moments where her body signaled exhaustion long before her mind allowed rest. Moments where sadness lingered beneath productivity. Moments where she kept moving because stopping felt too dangerous. The book reframes rest not as laziness, but as listening. Listening to what your body has been whispering while your mind was busy performing. As she continues her conversation with New York, the city becomes quieter. Not because it changed, but because her relationship to it did. She stops projecting expectations onto it. She stops expecting it to save her. And this is crucial, because many people unconsciously outsource fulfillment. They expect a city, a job, a partner, or a milestone to complete them. But the book reveals a hard truth. No external structure can replace internal stability. When you stop asking the world to validate you, you start building something more sustainable, self-trust. This leads to one of the most emotionally powerful moments in the book, grief. Not grief for a person, but grief for versions of herself. The life she imagined. The person she thought she'd be by now. The certainty she believed adulthood would bring. Stephanie allows herself to mourn without rushing to reframe. And this is rare, because society pressures people to stay positive and move on. But grief that isn't felt becomes weight. The book teaches that grieving old identities is part of becoming authentic. You cannot grow while clinging to who you thought you had to be. Letting go hurts, but holding on costs more. As this section closes, Stephanie reaches a quiet realization. Healing is not dramatic. It's subtle. It's choosing honesty over image, rest over recognition, presence over perfection. It's letting yourself be human, without apology. And slowly, fragmented parts begin to reconnect, not into perfection, but into coherence. We'll pause here, because what comes next is the book's transformation phase. Rebuilding identity without survival patterns. Redefining success and fulfillment. Learning how to live without constant self-surveillance. And applying these insights to everyday life. As Dear New York moves forward, something quiet but profound begins to happen. The urgency fades. Not because life becomes easier, but because Stephanie stops fighting herself. This is where the book transitions from survival to integration. She begins asking a different set of questions. Not, how do I become more? But, what happens if I stop running from who I already am? This shift changes everything. For much of her life, becoming felt like effort, like pressure, like constant self-monitoring. But now, becoming starts to feel like allowing. Allowing rest. Allowing uncertainty. Allowing imperfection. The book explains that many people confuse growth with self-rejection. They think becoming better means becoming different. But real growth often means becoming more honest. Stephanie starts reevaluating success. Not success as the world defines it, but success as it feels internally. She reflects on moments where achievements looked impressive but felt empty. Moments where external validation didn't quiet internal doubt. And she recognizes something crucial. If your definition of success excludes peace, it will always feel incomplete. This insight resonates deeply in modern life, where hustle culture equates exhaustion with worth. The book doesn't shame ambition, it contextualizes it. Ambition is not the problem. Disconnection is. When ambition is fueled by fear, it never rests. When it's fueled by purpose, it knows when to pause. Stephanie begins separating what she genuinely wants from what she learned to chase. This is not easy, because many desires aren't truly ours, they're inherited. Inherited from culture, from family expectations, from comparison. The book emphasizes that clarity requires silence. You can't hear yourself while constantly reacting to the world. As she redefines success, Stephanie also reevaluates her relationship with money. Not as numbers, but as meaning. She explores how money often becomes a proxy for security, freedom, and worth. When people grow up feeling unstable, money becomes emotional insurance. Not against poverty, but against vulnerability. The book gently reveals how financial anxiety is rarely about finances alone. It's about safety, control, fear of dependence. Stephanie notices how she equated earning with deserving, how rest felt irresponsible, how slowing down felt risky. But she begins questioning this belief. Is money meant to support life or replace it? This question lingers, and it invites listeners to examine their own relationship with work and worth. The book then moves into habits, not as productivity hacks, but as emotional patterns. Stephanie realizes her routines weren't neutral. They were responses. Overworking was avoidance. Busyness was numbing. Structure was safety. When life feels unpredictable, control becomes comforting. But control can also become confinement. The book introduces a powerful idea. Habits reveal what we're trying to protect ourselves from. Once you understand the emotional function of a habit, you can change it compassionately, not by force, but by awareness. As integration continues, Stephanie describes moments of stillness. Moments that once felt uncomfortable now feel grounding. She allows herself to sit without distraction, to walk without urgency, to exist without performance. And she realizes something beautiful. Stillness isn't emptiness. It's presence. Most people fear stillness because it brings unresolved feelings to the surface. But once those feelings are acknowledged, stillness becomes nourishing. The book reframes solitude as connection, not to others, but to self. This is especially powerful in a world that equates solitude with loneliness. Stephanie shows that loneliness comes from disconnection. Solitude comes from alignment. As her inner world stabilizes, her outer relationships change. She stops chasing intensity, stops performing competence, stops over-explaining herself. She becomes more selective, not from fear, but from self-respect. The book emphasizes that boundaries aren't walls. They're clarity. When you know who you are, you don't need to defend it. And when you honor your limits, you invite healthier connections. Psychologically, this stage of the book highlights nervous system regulation. Though not stated clinically, it's deeply felt. Stephanie describes how her reactions soften. She pauses before responding, breathes before reacting, listens before judging. This is healing in practice. Not dramatic breakthroughs, but consistent gentleness. The book teaches that healing shows up as choice. The ability to choose response over reflex, truth over approval, rest over exhaustion. As the narrative approaches its later stages, Stephanie reflects on identity again, but this time with compassion. She no longer sees her fractured beginnings as flaws. She sees them as context. They shaped her sensitivity, her insight, her resilience. The book delivers a powerful message. Your past is not an obstacle to becoming. It is part of the material you build with. Nothing was wasted. Even pain taught awareness. Even confusion taught depth. New York, once again, fades into symbolism. The city no longer defines her story, it witnesses it. She no longer writes to the city asking for answers. She writes knowing she carries them. This marks a quiet but profound transformation. She has moved from seeking to standing. We'll pause here, because what comes next is the final arc. How to apply these lessons in daily life. How viewers can integrate this wisdom into career, relationships, and self-growth. And the emotionally powerful conclusion that ties everything together. As Dear New York reaches its final movement, the voice of the book becomes softer, not weaker, but steadier. This is the voice of someone who no longer needs to convince, perform, or prove. It's the voice of someone who has learned how to live with herself. Stephanie no longer writes from urgency. She writes from presence. And that difference is everything. The final sections of the book focus on application, though not in a traditional, instructional way. Instead of telling you what to do, the book shows you how to be. How to show up to your life without armor. How to participate without abandoning yourself. How to move forward without running. Stephanie reflects on how becoming whole didn't require radical external change. No dramatic reinvention. No perfect healing moment. No clean ending. It required attention. Attention to her thoughts. Attention to her body. Attention to her emotional signals. And this is where the book speaks directly to the listener. Because most people don't need more motivation. They need permission. Permission to slow down. permission to feel conflicted, permission to choose differently. She begins connecting her inner work to everyday life. Career, for example. Stephanie explains that when your identity is built on survival, work becomes a battlefield. You overextend, overperform, over-identify. Your job becomes your proof of worth. But once identity stabilizes internally, work becomes a tool, not a test. You can pursue growth without self-erasure. You can be ambitious without being consumed. You can succeed without sacrificing yourself. This reframing is especially powerful for viewers navigating burnout, pressure, or career confusion. The book reminds us, you are more than what you produce. In relationships, Stephanie notices the most change. She no longer tries to earn closeness. She allows it. She communicates without over-explaining, expresses needs without apologizing, listens without disappearing. This is the quiet confidence of someone who trusts herself. The book shows that healthy relationships don't require perfection. They require presence. When you stop abandoning yourself, you stop asking others to complete you. Connection becomes shared, not demanded. Financially, Stephanie begins relating to money with less fear. Not because she has more, but because she understands herself better. She no longer sees money as proof of safety. She sees it as support. This shift reduces anxiety, creates balance, restores agency. And if you want more deep, transformative book journeys like this one, support the universe of book by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and turning on notifications. Because books don't just change minds. They change lives when we let them. Thank you for listening.